Hello, this is John Deedy, Professor of Political Science at the Community Colleges of Baltimore County. Today's lecture series, I'm going to discuss the writing of the Constitution. In 1787, our country, to put it politely, was an economic basket case. Political divisions, lack of respect of government, etc. The Articles of Confederation were not working at all. In February of 1787, the Continental Congress agreed to a proposal to have a meeting in Philadelphia in May for the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles. The delegates, some of them that were going to be picked, were going to go to Philadelphia in May and revise and fix the Articles as best as they could. James Madison was one of the people who was going to go. And Madison's intent wasn't on revising. It was about writing a new document. He saw things that were a mess. He's called the father of the Constitution and spent the next 3 months doing a lot of research, meeting with Washington, and thinking about a variety of ideas. Patrick Henry refused to attend the convention. He said he smelled a rat. The state of Rhode Island refused to go because they felt the convention would only weaken the power of the small states. 55 white males representing the states attended the convention. Some attended more frequently than others. In late May of that year, Edmund Randolph got up to speak, introducing the idea of the Virginia Plan that Madison had written. Washington was elected the presiding officer of the meeting and agreed with the idea of introducing the plan. The Virginia Plan called for major changes in the Articles. It called for basically a national legislature with 2 houses, an upper and lower. The upper house elected by the lower and the lower house elected by the people. It called for a national executive elected by the national legislature. It called for a national judiciary to be chosen by the legislature. It called for congressional veto over state laws, and along with the admission of new states and guaranteeing a Republican form of government. For the next 3 weeks, the delegates debated fiercely over these issues. Sometimes they would agree to an idea, and then the next day they would change their minds. Many of the delegates were caught flat-footed by this, but they felt something had to be done. One of the big things that they did early on was agree to keep the proceedings a secret as not to panic the public. Elizabeth Bowen wrote a book in the 1980s called Miracle at Philadelphia that discussed a lot of the history of these events. In the middle of June, Edmund Randolph, a delegate from New Jersey, proposed introducing his own ideas. Patterson was from a small state and kind of wanted to keep the Articles of Confederation. Madison agreed to give him his opportunity to present his ideas, and for an entire day they debated the New Jersey Plan. Patterson's ideas included continuing the Articles with a one-house legislature, but having a single executive elected by Congress, with plural executives if necessary. State laws, he said, should be subordinate to the federal laws. He said a federal judiciary with a supreme tribunal of judges should be appointed by the president. He also said that Congress should have the power to raise revenue and regulate trade and commerce. Patterson's plan was defeated, but many of his ideas later became part of our Constitution. His idea for a plural executive became the idea of a presidential cabinet. The biggest issue at the convention was over the issue of congressional representation. The southern states were going to win this battle. The northern states wanted representation done, but not to give the South too much power. The 2 big issues in representation was do it by the wealth of the state, and the southern states were going to say, well, our slaves are property, so we're wealthy, we should get more representatives. When they talked about doing it by representation by people, the southern states said, well, our slaves are people, we should get more representation. They never advocated giving them rights to vote. They just wanted more representation. Finally, James Wilson of Pennsylvania came up with an idea called the 3/5 Compromise, where every slave would be counted as 3/5 of a person. Sounding terrible today, but it was a compromise needed to be done in 1787. The North was happy because this would weaken a little bit of the power of the southern states. The northern states opposed slavery, mainly on economic grounds, because the southern states could undercut them. Many of the compromises that were done at the convention really postponed the Civil War by many years, but were necessary at the time. During early July, there was a lot of contention and debate over how to do representation. The convention actually almost broke up a couple times over this issue. Roger Sherman came up with an idea called the Connecticut Compromise, known as the Great Compromise. Twice before, this proposal had been debated and defeated, but with a break in the weather over a couple days, suddenly cooler heads prevailed. Sherman's idea of a Connecticut Compromise, which it was called, basically said, count the House by people using James Wilson's 3/5 compromise. And for the Senate, 2 senators every state no matter what. Delaware has 1 million people to have 1 House member, 2 senators. Maryland has 8 House members, has 2 senators. California, with millions of people, has just 2 senators. This would create a balance to where the large states could not overrun the new government. This allowed the smaller states to compromise on a bunch of other issues because they saw the Senate as a roadblock to stop legislation that might hurt smaller states. And when I say smaller states, I mean based on population. The other big issue before they had a brief adjournment was over the issue of the power of the presidency. Our president has the power they have today, in part because of the role of Washington at the convention. He spoke very little at the convention, but Washington's role as a leader, and many felt he would be the first president. The delegates looked at the powers they were going to give the president, and they felt if they could trust Washington with these powers, a president in the future could have the similar powers. People were concerned about giving the president too much power because of the memories of the bad kings they had. As I mentioned, in late July, they had about a 10-day adjournment. Washington went fishing. Some delegates stayed behind to work on a first draft. When the delegates came back to the meeting room in Philadelphia in Independence Hall, they read the first draft of the Constitution, and some were shocked. In many ways, they didn't realize what they were agreeing to, but they realized they had to do this. In August, the major issue debate was over the issue of slavery. They finally came up with the 1808 Compromise that basically said that slaves could be imported until 1808. And until then, no provisions could be made to restrict the importation of slavery. Slaves could be taxed at $10 a head, and slaves in the Constitution were referred to at that time as other persons. The South basically said, if we don't get a compromise on slavery, there's not going to be any union. One of the other issues of debate was amending the Constitution. Should it be done by 2/3 of the states or 3/4? In the end, they chose 3/4. In part, it made it more difficult to get rid of the institution of slavery. Another issue of debate at the convention in late August was over whether to add a Bill of Rights to the Constitution. This idea was rejected in part not because the Founding Fathers opposed rights, but they used too much logic in their heads. They felt since there's nothing in the Constitution restricting free speech, we don't need to add anything guaranteeing that right. Later on, the delegates realized during the debate over ratification that they had to do something. And one of the first acts of the new Congress in 1789 was proposing a Bill of Rights, authored, of course, by James Madison. One of the last issues of the convention was how to write the final style. Governor Morris did the final draft and added a preamble. We the people, in order for a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, etc. The delegates signed. Randolph refused to sign because he felt the document was not perfect. Patterson, who came up with the New Jersey plan, did sign. The official papers were given to Washington, and the delegates went to dinner, 31 signers altogether. The reaction of the population was joy in many ways. The debate to ratify. People were happy. And the camp split into 2 groups. The Federalists, men like Washington, Adams, Jefferson, Madison, Franklin, supporters of the Constitution. 3 men, Madison, Hamilton, and John Jay, later wrote a document called the Federalist Papers, published it in various newspapers, 85 essays, expounding the virtues of the Constitution. The group that opposed the Constitution ratification, people like Patrick Henry and Richard Henry Lee, were known as the Anti-Federalists. They opposed the Constitution because they did not feel there was a need for a big government. They feared the power of the government over the people. They wanted state-run government. They opposed the power of the government, the tax, a variety of issues that we still hear a little bit about today. The Federalists, they said it was either this or disunion, and those were the stakes at hand. Many of the documents used in the Federalist Papers, many of the writings of Madison and Hamilton still live today as a testament to our times and the various things that they said. The Federalist Papers had a huge impact on ratification. Delaware was the first state to ratify. And if you notice on many Delaware license plates, it says the first state. Pennsylvania ratified next. Shortly afterwards, Georgia ratified. And by the end of the year, 3 states had already ratified. In early 1788, New Jersey and Connecticut ratified. They were ratifying by large margins, and many people felt one of the reasons for their support for ratification, being small states, was they felt they wanted the protection of a large federal government, fear of being overrun by other states or even other countries. The first major push and debate was in Massachusetts, where the Anti-Federalists organized, and they focused on one big issue: no Bill of Rights. It was something they hammered at. They said this was unfair. They said people should have their rights guaranteed. This is where the Federalists made one of the first campaign promises ever that was kept. They promised, if you ratify this document, we'll add a Bill of Rights later, which of course was done. The Federalists were a little more disorganized, but in the end, Massachusetts approved. A short time later, Maryland approved. But when Maryland approved, 12 of the signers signed a document basically saying they felt the document was defective, the Constitution. They supported adding a Bill of Rights also. South Carolina ratified in early May. There were 8 states. In mid-June, New Hampshire and Virginia were meeting. You only needed 9 states for ratification. That's what the people in Philadelphia decided. It was best to do it by just having 9 states because they felt that they couldn't get every state unanimous, considering the fact Rhode Island refused to show up. New Hampshire narrowly approved. But most people, even though they said, hey, we got 9, people said, this isn't secure yet. Virginia still had to weigh in, so did New York. These were the largest states. These were some of the leaders as far as the writers of the new Constitution. Washington did not attend the Virginia Convention, but showed his support. Edmund Randolph supported ratification. Even though he said he would not sign the document, Randolph later said he supported the idea of adding rights. Patrick Henry, during the convention in Virginia, threw everything but the kitchen sink. In the end, the Virginia delegates ratified. Now you had 10 states. Many people went to Henry afterwards and said, what do we do now? And Henry said to go home. We did our best, and it's time to support the new government. New York ratified in July by only 3 votes. And now you had 11 states. And now planning for a national election. North Carolina refused to ratify the first time. A couple months after Washington had been elected in 1789, North Carolina ratified, being the 12th state. Rhode Island, which did not attend, ratified a year after Washington had been elected president, and they only ratified by 2 votes. Our Constitution is a fascinating document, and the writing process and what Madison did was fascinating. When thinking about our Constitution, it is a long living document that has survived many challenges. And the writing of the Constitution would be very different today than it was in 1787. But it is a document that has endured and has been copied by other countries for ages. Take care. Have a great day.